Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the second week of the course. You survived the first week, so bravo! I'm the little talking head down at the bottom left corner this time, just to keep you guessing. I'm Rob, I'm the instructor for the course, and we are moving into week 2. So, during the first week of the term, we were talking about kind of the long history of the United States up through the Civil War, going all the way back to the initial colonization back in the 17th century. So we covered a lot of time and a lot of ground last week. This week we're slowing it down a little bit. We're going to focus mainly on the decade of the 1850s in the readings for this week. But I do want to talk a little bit about, kind of provide some context, tell you a little bit of a story about how that last decade worked. And what I'm calling here the Road to Disunion. I'm not the first to call it that. There's actually a really well-written book called The Road to Disunion by William Freeling, which some of you may be checking out at some point during the term. But this is an attempt to kind of tell a story to kind of tie a lot of these disparate events together. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. You've got the readings for that. You've got the internet for that. You can find details about these events anywhere. Basically, what I want to do is provide you a very high-level overview about what's happening in the final years before the Civil War. Now, this is my story. I mean, it's the story of other people, but this is the story as I'm telling it. This is assembled a little bit differently than the readings and the textbooks that you've had, but it's going to cover a lot of the same material and hopefully provide you a little bit more context for what's happening. So, first, Civil War and Reconstruction, the road to disunion. Now, I'm going to cover these topics here today. What I'm talking about, the Great Divergence, I'll explain that in a bit. Engines of change, basically what is causing that divergence. Attempts to compromise to try to limit the damage from that divergence. And then start talking about some of the general mindsets that are starting to set in among Americans, North and South, up in those last years before the Civil War. And then we'll talk about some of the last straws that really drove home the idea that something bad is about to happen. And in some ways, it may be irreversible. So, this is the stuff that we're going to talk about here today. First off, the Great Divergence. When I say that, I'm basically picking up where I left off last time. When I had this chart here, where I was talking about all the way back at the beginning, you had New England versus the Chesapeake colonies. They came together to work together to build the nation. From between the 1750s and the early 19th century, and then throughout the 19th century, once the country was up and running, at that point, the two sides started to diverge yet again, North versus South. And so today, like last time, we're talking about mainly this divergence period. What is causing this divergence between North and South? Okay, now just a couple high-level things that are happening here at this time. In the 19th century, a lot of Americans started taking seriously this whole idea that all men are created equal. That was a really nice catchphrase as part of the Declaration of Independence. And a lot of people started wondering, as time went on, how does that apply to all men? What does it mean? What do we mean by all men? Are black men included in that? What about women? It doesn't say all women are created equal, but there's a lot of women who believe that they should be considered equal with men. And so there's a growing discussion among Americans in the mid-19th century about what do we mean by all men are created equal. And a lot of realization that, we actually don't treat everybody equally, and that's kind of a problem. Now, there was a reform movement in the early 19th century. Some people call it one of the Great Awakenings, but there was this sense that we need to fix the problems in this country. And one of the problems in this country, of course, was slavery, among many other problems. But as you've seen in some of the readings, there's going to be a sense among people who are opposed to slavery, a growing sense among those folks that, slavery is not going to fix itself. It's not going to just die out on its own, no matter how much we might want it to. And so some people are going to start talking about, let's make this happen. This country's greatest original sin is slavery, from the perspective of those abolitionists. We need to fix that, and we need to do it right away. We need to do it immediately. And there's even a religious component to it. Millennialism there's a religious idea where we have to just wait, and then eventually Christ will return and restore a perfect balance to the universe. That's a premillennial way to look at it. We have to wait for God or for Jesus to make that happen. There's a new movement that takes root in the 19th century, though, which says that, you know what we should do? We should try to bring about perfection in order to bring about the end times. So, we basically need to prove to God and to Christ that we are worthy of being saved. One of the ways to do that is to fix the country's problems. The biggest problem facing the country is slavery. Okay, so that's happening. So there's kind of a religious fervor that's starting to enter into this debate. We've got new political parties coming into being in the mid-1900s. We'll talk about a couple of those later on. But before the Jackson era, there had been a couple of political parties back during the Washington-Jefferson days, but then we went into that era of good feelings, and then during the Jackson era, we suddenly start to see new political parties developing. And that is going to be important because those political parties are going to develop large followings, and they're going to be able to set the tone of debate in the country. One other thing that I wanted to point out, and I think I pointed it out briefly last time, but one of the reasons in this diagram, I'm showing the north, the arrow to the north is much more, at a higher angle than the arrow going down to the south. One of the reasons I did that is that the north is the one that's changing. All of these changes that I've been talking about here, these are debates that are happening in the north, and they're all about slavery and economic systems and all of that is happening in the north. In the south, there's not much change happening throughout this period. There's a whole lot of change going on in the north, though. And so when we get to the Civil War, there's going to be a lot of complaints from Southerners that, the North, they're the ones that changed. They're the ones that brought this on because they're the ones that were pursuing all these crazy newfangled ideas, like all men are created equal. Not a new idea, but they're the ones that are starting to think about it seriously. Northerners are the ones who are starting to think about bringing about a perfect society in order to prove our worthiness to God. Northerners are the ones that are embracing this idea. And so the North is where change is seriously happening throughout this period here. And so Southerners are going to complain. Northerners are the ones that changed, not us, so therefore the war should be blamed on the North. We'll come back to that as the term goes on, of course. Okay, but again, we're focusing on this last period here. What I'm calling this Great Divergence. I don't know if any other historians offhand call it that or not. I'm just calling it that because looking at this map with these arrows, you kind of see how the two are growing apart. And so I'm just focusing on this as a Great Divergence, kind of as a shorthand for myself here. So when I say this term over the course of this lecture and subsequent lectures, this is what I'm talking about. This period here in which North and South are diverging to the point of war. Okay. So, everybody recognizes North and South are splitting. As you are hopefully aware, though, there were a bunch of compromises and a bunch of attempts to try to stop it from getting too far. Because everybody saw that, the final result, if we allow these two groups to diverge far enough, eventually there's going to be a point of no return, and eventually there's going to be conflict. When the system tears apart, something bad is going to happen. Let's try to prevent the system from falling apart. And so, Congress put together a bunch of compromises over time. The first compromise that I'm going to mention here, I'm going to mention 4 compromises today. First is the Constitution itself. Way back during that period when both sides kind of got along a lot more than they did in the 1900s, there was this constitutional convention where both sides were able to hammer out a document that satisfied both sides enough for them to join together and to create this new country. Now, the compromise involved the Constitution was, there were a lot of little bits and pieces of the Constitution. All of them, though, had to make both sides happy. And so we ended up with things like the 3/5 compromise, where a slave counts as 3/5 of a white person. We have things like a bicameral Congress, a House of Representatives versus a Senate. Senate, which is based on, basically 2 votes per state. And then the House of Representatives, which is based on population. Northerners wanted Congress to be only the House of Representatives. Southerners wanted Congress to be only the Senate, because there's more people in the North. So Southerners wanted to balance Northern population by having basically one state, one vote, one state, two votes in the Senate. The Great Compromise was, well, let's create two houses of Congress. One is the House, which is going to be based on population, which probably means it's going to be dominated by Northerners. The other house is going to be a Senate, where it's one state, one vote, two votes. And so that one's probably going to be dominated by Southerners. So that way we've got a balance built in here. Hopefully that's going to be a compromise. Maybe that'll make things not get so bad later. It's going to get worse, but that's the thinking. It gets worse, and by 1820, they have to compromise again. They come up with the 1820 Compromise, the Missouri Compromise, that famous line at the southern border of Missouri, where any state that comes in north of that line is going to be a free state. Anything south of that line is going to be a slave state. Again, this is seen as a compromise. Okay, this is a way to solve the slavery problem. Done. Right? Wrong. 30 years later, there's going to be another compromise because that Missouri Compromise just isn't going to make everybody happy. So we have a third compromise. In the wake of the Mexican War, with the acquisition of all of that territory out in the far west, California, Utah, New Mexico, California, Utah, New Mexico, all of that territory came in as a result of the Mexican War. So then the question becomes, what are we going to do with that land? And the old Missouri Compromise doesn't seem to make people happy anymore. And so we have to compromise yet again in order to figure out what to do with all this land out in the West. The Compromise of 1850 is a very sprawling, complicated compromise, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but it helps to remember that there were three parts to it. The first part, and all of these parts are compromises north and south. North gets something, south gets something. For part one, California becomes a free state. So Northerners get this massive free state of California, which is immensely wealthy because of all those gold deposits out there. In exchange, Southerners get popular sovereignty in New Mexico and Utah. Popular sovereignty means that we'll take a vote. There may be slavery, there may not be slavery, depending on what the people in those territories want. So what this means, in the big picture, is that now we possibly will have slavery introduced into a new territory which would otherwise be north of that compromise line, that Missouri Compromise line. So, Northerners get California, Southerners get the possibility of allowing slavery into a much larger chunk of territory north of the compromise line. That's part one. Part two, we're going to shrink the size of Texas. Northerners get that. The New Mexico territory gets carved out of this western chunk of Texas, so the size of Texas gets smaller. In exchange, for Southerners, the federal government is going to take all of Texas's debt away. Texas had accrued a bunch of debts during the Mexican War and the time that Texas was an independent nation, and so the federal government's going to take over that debt, so now Texas is debt-free. In exchange, though, they got shrunk down a bit. Part three, we're going to outlaw slavery in the nation's capital, or the slave trade in the nation's capital. We're not going to outlaw slavery. Slavery continues to exist. Remember that Washington, D.C. is squeezed between two slave states, so slavery is legal there. However, we're going to outlaw the slave trade in Washington, D.C. One of the things that had always been kind of a thorn in the side of abolitionists was the idea that if you go to our nation's capital to see the birthplace of, the shining city on a hill, the greatest country that's ever been built, just outside the U.S. Capitol was one of the largest slave markets in North America. That looked really bad. So we're going to outlaw slavery or the slave trade in Washington, D.C., but in exchange, we're going to get a new fugitive slave law. And we're going to talk more about that in just a sec. But that's the Compromise of 1850. Big, sprawling compromise. Congress thought they had fixed everything. Sweet, everything is done. Right? No. 4 years later, the crisis comes to a head again. The problem was that there had been this unorganized territory left behind during the Compromise of 1850 that was never covered. So this chunk of land was owned by the United States, but was not organized into territories or states. 1854 Compromise, also known as Kansas-Nebraska, fixed that by turning that into two new territories. In exchange for creating new territories, though, we're going to open those up to popular sovereignty also, which means, again, possibly the expansion of slavery into all this territory up here. So the old Missouri Compromise is obviously, it's not dead, but nobody cares about it anymore. And so this was a compromise, again, trying to appease both sides. As you can imagine, it did not appease both sides. Southerners like it in some ways. Northerners don't really like it at all. Okay, so there were these series of compromises. None of them worked, obviously. But those are the four compromises, though. So going forward, whenever I talk about the four great compromises before the Civil War, I'm talking the U.S. Constitution, the Missouri Compromise of 1820, the Compromise of 1850, and trying to get so you can see my fingers, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Those are the four big compromises over slavery before the Civil War. Okay, so now let's talk about what's going on, though, at the same time that Congress is trying to compromise, trying to bring everybody together. But at the same time, there are things that are pushing everybody apart. Northerners and Southerners are starting to get very mad at each other, and they're starting to see conspiracies in the behavior of the other side. And so first we're going to talk about what was considered to be the slave power conspiracy. This was held by Northerners who believed that Southerners were unfairly stacking the deck in Southerners' favor and unfairly expanding slavery at the expense of Northerners. And I mean, the one way to look at it for Northerners who believed that Southerners exerted too much power was simply to look at the construction of the government. As this list is showing you here, 10 of the first 15 presidents had been slave owners, which probably means the president is, pro-slavery and anti-North by extension. 17 of 27 speakers of the House were from the South. 31 of 53 presidents pro tem of the Senate were from the South. 19 of 34 Supreme Court justices were from the South. And as I mentioned before, the Southern power base was in the U.S. Senate. The Northerners had a power base in the House of Representatives, but that was only because of the greater population of the North, not because of any structural plans, whereas the rest of this stuff looked like it was probably some sort of a structural thing. And so Northerners who want to look for conspiracies have a very easy, it's pretty easy to find conspiracies for Northerners. In addition to things like these numbers here, you have things like the gag rule, which the Senate imposed, both houses of Congress imposed in the 1830s and 1840s, which is basically that as abolitionist groups send petitions to Congress asking them to abolish slavery, and Southerners say no, every time one of those petitions comes in, you start another fight. You see another fight starting in the House and in the Senate. And so the House and the Senate are getting tired of fighting about this every couple of weeks when a new petition arrives, and so they just decided to impose a gag rule, where we're just going to cut off and ignore all petitions that come in. Now that solved the problem, in that they didn't have to spend their time fighting about it, but this is going to cause a huge controversy for Northerners, because Northerners see this gag rule as basically Congress ignoring the will of the people. Northerners put together petitions, send them to Congress, and Congress ignores them. That's bad from a Northern perspective, because we're being ignored. We Northerners are being ignored. And that's not good. So this has a huge effect on Northerners, because now it's like, okay, so if we as American citizens are unable to petition our government for redress of grievances, and it's being done at the behest of Southerners, what does that mean for us, Northerners? Does that mean that we're no better than slaves? Because now all those slave owners are telling us what to do. So, that starts to look a lot like white Northerners are being enslaved by white Southerners. Now, you may think that's being overly dramatic, and that's fine, but that's what people were thinking at the time. You're not going to let me talk to government because I don't like your belief about slavery? Well, then are you trying to enslave me also? I don't know. And this gives birth to parties like the Free Soil Party, slogans like free soil, free labor, free men, free speech. The idea that by gagging discussion of slavery, we are abolishing a whole bunch of individual rights and liberties that all Americans should be entitled to by the U.S. Constitution. But it's just not happening because of this gag rules in effect. All right, so the slave power holds all of these positions in the government. They are preventing Americans from talking about slavery, at least in the government offices. Northerners feel a sense of betrayal during the James K. Polk years. Polk ran for president in 1844, promising to go to war against Mexico to seize all that land around Texas. He also promised to go to war against the British to take all of that Oregon territory. When push came to shove, the Mexican War happened. We went to war with Mexico. We ended up seizing all of this territory. We ended up occupying Mexico City. So we basically conquered all of Mexico and then just decided to take half of it for ourselves and massively expanded the size of the United States. Expanded the size of Texas, got a whole bunch of new states where, back at this point, the Missouri Compromise was still in effect. And so if you draw that line all the way out to the Pacific Ocean, that's a whole lot of territory that's now opened up for slavery. At the same time, though, he refused to go to war against the British for Oregon, and he decided to just compromise with the British. They basically cut Oregon in half. The northern half went to the British, the southern half went to the U.S. So, from the northern perspective, the President of the United States had promised that we would go to war against Mexico to expand land to the south to appease Southerners. He also promised we would go to war against the British to take Oregon and to appease Northerners. What happened? We went to war to appease Southerners, but he caved for Northerners and only got half of the land that should have been entitled to them. So the old 54-40 or fight campaign promise came to nothing. And so Northerners looked at this as he was caved, and he allowed the Southerners to get what they want, but did not give Northerners what they wanted. And then Southerners started getting away with a whole bunch of other stuff too. These filibustering expeditions, which I don't remember if the textbook mentioned or not, but in the 1850s, a series of private citizens in the South decided to launch military campaigns in Central America, Mexico, Cuba, and the Caribbean, to try to expand into these territories and hopefully bring in new territory as slave states. These would be south of the Missouri Compromise line, and so we would bring in new slave states carved out of these old foreign countries. And so Narciso Lopez launched an expedition to Cuba with a bunch of mercenaries to try to overthrow the Cuban government and then bring Cuba into the United States as a new southern state. He failed. A few years later, William Walker guided a bunch of mercenaries, tried to do the same thing to Mexico and then to Honduras and then to Nicaragua. Both of these guys got repelled and sent back to the U.S. Now, there's a law in place which says that private citizens cannot conduct diplomacy on behalf of the United States. Private citizens cannot go to war on behalf of the United States. It's illegal. And so both of these guys, when they got sent back to the United States, Northerners wanted these guys to be put on trial for violating neutrality laws and to go to jail for these activities. Local juries, though, in the American South, whenever these guys got put on trial, came back with not guilty verdicts. And then a few years later, each of them built new armies and tried again. That's why we've got multiple arrows here. Narciso Lopez went to Cuba, I think 3 times. On the 3rd time, they finally just put him up against a wall and shot him. Didn't send him back to the U.S. William Walker tried northern Mexico, and then Honduras, and then Nicaragua. And then finally in Nicaragua, he was put up against a wall and shot rather than returned to the United States because, you keep sending them back. So, so they're not going to deal with that anymore. And so these guys got shot. So they did not succeed in doing any of this. But Northerners believe that these guys are bad. And the fact that Southerners basically let them get away with it, that's bad too. So Southerners are complicit in this conspiracy. And then there's also, outright violence against Northerners and abolitionists. First off, there's kind of constant level of violence against Northerners. You can think about like the Elijah Lovejoy murder in Illinois, he was a abolitionist who was murdered by a mob of pro-slavery Illinoisans. But another famous episode was the beating of Charles Sumner in the U.S. Senate on May 22nd of 1856. Charles Sumner was an abolitionist, Northern Republican who had given a speech outlining the crimes against Kansas, which you've read about in some of the textbooks. And in that speech, he named senators who profited from slavery. And one of those senators, his relative, this guy named Preston Brooks, who was a congressman in the House of Representatives, took offense to that, walked in one day and beat the bejesus out of Charles Sumner there on the floor of the Senate. Preston Brooks was, he wasn't punished. He resigned from the House, went back home, never faced any kind of consequences for the beating. Charles Sumner spent, I believe, 2 years recovering from this. May have been more. Charles Sumner didn't return back to the Senate for quite some time because of the extent of his injuries. Brooks went back home, was never prosecuted, and in fact was actually reelected back to Congress a year or two later with no harm done to his political career. And so from the Northern perspective, Southerners are able to get away with violence now. Southerners are getting away with a lot of nasty stuff, and that's not fair. Now, Southerners, though, believe pretty much the same thing of Northerners. Southerners are going to see a lot of things that Northerners doing that they don't like. One of the things that Southerners don't like about Northerners is that they're really tolerant of radical nutjob abolitionists like Lloyd Garrison and the Anti-Slavery Society of America. The Anti-Slavery Society, in their Declaration of Sentiments in 1833, declared that these are very radical ideas. No compensation should be given to planters emancipating their slaves. If compensation is to be given at all, it should be given to the outraged and guiltless slaves and not to those who have plundered and abused them. Freeing the slave is not depriving them of property, but restoring it to its rightful owner. It's not wronging the master, but righting the slave, restoring him to himself. Now, this type of stuff seems sensible to us today, but back in the 1830s, this stuff goes against the idea of the Constitution. The Constitution allows slavery. The Constitution allows people to profit on slavery. And so the idea that we're going to get rid of slavery with no due process and with no compensation, that's unconstitutional from the perspective of Southerners. And so Northerners who tolerate William Lloyd Garrison and tolerate things like the Anti-Slavery Society, they're tolerating unconstitutional behavior and anti-constitutional sentiments. And that's dangerous because these radical nutjobs are going to destroy the Constitution and possibly destroy the country. Northerners are also creating personal liberty laws, which seems really upsetting to Southerners. Now, in the court case of Prigg versus Pennsylvania, the Supreme Court had decided that Northerners could not stop Southerners from retrieving runaway slaves in Northern territory. However, Northerners don't have to necessarily help Southerners grab their former slaves or their runaway slaves. And so in the wake of this Supreme Court decision, Northern states started to pass personal liberty laws where they basically codified that, saying that you, as a resident of this state, if you don't want to help a Southern slave catcher catch a runaway slave, you don't have to help. You can't interfere. You can't hide the slave from the slave catcher, but you don't have to actually help them to catch the slave. This is also unconstitutional from a Southern perspective, even though the Supreme Court just said it was constitutional. Because in the U.S. Constitution, there's a provision that says there's a fugitive slave provision in there that no, all Americans are required to help slave catchers catch their slaves. And so the idea that Northern states are going to allow personal liberty laws is an affront to the U.S. Constitution. As an aside, anytime somebody tells you that Southerners went to war in the Civil War over states' rights, this is how you refute that. Because if they really cared about states' rights, then they would have been okay with these personal liberty laws. The problem is that these personal liberty laws, they didn't like them, and so they wanted them to go away. Southerners were not very big on states' rights, and we will see that as the course goes on. The Southerners very rarely invoked states' rights as a reason for the Civil War, but we'll come back to that. So other things that Northerners are doing that are scaring and angering Southerners, we're disrespecting property by helping Southerners to escape, Southern slaves to escape, I should say, via the Underground Railroad. By helping Southerners, by helping slaves escape Southerners, we are disrespecting property rights. The U.S. Constitution allows slaves as property. Northerners, through the Underground Railroad, are stealing Southerners' property and smuggling it out of reach of the Southerners. And so, from the Southern perspective, the Underground Railroad is theft, and Northerners are tolerating it, and that's obscene. Northerners are obviously violating the Constitution by supporting this theft and smuggling of property away from Southerners. Northerners are going even farther. They're creating entire political parties based on the destruction of slavery. The Liberty Party ran a candidate in 1844, that same one that James Polk won. The Liberty Party didn't win, obviously, but as you can see by this map here, they won a whole bunch of counties, or at least a lot of support in northern counties. That's dangerous because, oh boy, that entire party was dedicated to the abolition of slavery. Another party, the Free Soil Party, in 1848 to 1856, they're the ones that popularized that slogan I mentioned a few minutes ago, in free soil, free labor, free men, free speech. That was another northern party directed towards the destruction of slavery. So from the southern perspectives, northerners are tolerating radicals, like the Anti-Slavery Society. They're tolerating theft and smuggling. They're also tolerating the creation of political parties that are dedicated to the destruction of the Southern way of life. That's dangerous. And then you've got the Republican Party, of course, is the big one, established in 1856. Going to go on to much bigger things in 1860. But this whole party was dedicated to the destruction of the Southern way of life, because it was opposed to the expansion of slavery and possibly the eventual eradication of slavery. So, from the Southern perspective, Northerners are doing lots of bad things, and Northerners, we talked about Southern violence against Northerners with Charles Sumner and against abolitionists. From the Southern perspective, there's just stuff that's just as bad as happening to Southerners. John Brown's raid in Kansas, where he and his family dragged 5 slave owners out of their beds in the middle of the night and hacked them to death with broadswords, that's bad. John Brown fled from Kansas, went back to New York City, and was received with a ticker tape parade as a returning hero of the North because of his actions against Southern slave owners. Southerners look at that and say, wow, that's not good. That's violating the law. This guy murdered 5 people. Don't care what his ideology is. It's cold-blooded murder. He should not be celebrated for that. But yet, Northerners are celebrating him for that. So that's not good. So there's these dueling conspiracies. Southerners believe that Northerners are up to no good. Northerners believe that Southerners are up to no good. And both of them have the ultimate goal of extinguishing the other side. So while Congress might be pursuing all those high-minded compromises that I talked about, the reality on the ground is that Southerners, and Northerners are getting so paranoid and so angry at each other that those compromises just are not going to matter. And then at the final years running up to the Civil War, we've got a bunch of last straws that just bring the whole thing down. One is the Dred Scott decision in 1857, which decreed that that slavery is essentially legal across the country. All black people are slaves, basically. Slaves do not have the standing to sue white people in court. It was an attempt to try to solve the slavery issue at the Supreme Court. Backfired badly. Ended up angering Northerners. The Lincoln-Douglas debates ended up angering Southerners because of proclamations like Lincoln's on June 16th of 1858, when he said this: "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently, half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it and place it where the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is in the course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates will push it forward till it shall become alike lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south." This is flowery language compared to the stuff we hear today, but this is also very apocalyptic language. This is basically saying the old country will not survive. The recent decades, we've seen this country dividing over the issue of slavery. It will not remain divided for long. It will be reunited one way or the other. And that is going to happen against, it's going to be violent when that happens. It's basically saying that we cannot exist the way we've been existing. Something's got to give. And when something gives, it's going to be bad. So Southerners are pointing to Lincoln as an extremist here, saying this guy is an apocalyptic nut job. He is, prophesying the end of the country, prophesying the destruction of the country. That's not good. And then we start to see open violence breaking out in places like Harper's Ferry in 1859. John Brown, again, deciding to cause some trouble, tries to raise a slave rebellion in Virginia, what is now West Virginia. Fails miserably. He ends up hanging for it, but it's a sign of things to come. And as John Brown was being led towards the noose on the day of his execution, someone asked him his last words, and he said something to the effect of, this is the first drop of blood in what's going to become a torrent. I forget what the exact language was. I should probably look that up. But anyway, he predicted that the country was going to start drowning in blood very quickly, and he was certainly right. But this demonstrated to people that there's danger on the horizon. Lincoln's prophecy is starting to look more and more real as time goes on. And then there's the final straw, the election of 1860, when that guy Lincoln is suddenly a presidential candidate from the North. And Southerners split their vote 3 ways, and so Lincoln somehow manages to win that election. And so in the wake of the 1860 presidential election, Southerners are shaken to their core, because that Northern conspiracy has now put Abraham Lincoln in the White House, and we as Southerners are in some serious trouble. So that's where we stand. That's a very quick overview, I know, but hopefully it helps to establish some context for what we're doing here this week. So that's where I'm going to leave it. We'll come back next week, talk about secession and all that. Until then, you've got a few assignments. Take a look at the syllabus to see what those are and the various rubrics on Brightspace. And we will talk again soon. Take care.